So the first thing we're going to do is go into fspy and try to match the settings of the image we have. So I'll just drag in my image and you will get these lines here to represent the vanishing points of the different axes. So you have the X and Y. All you have to do is match them with the vanishing lines in your image. For example, I can match this with this line and match this with this. And on the Y, just match them with any lines that are going in that direction. After that, you just have to save this. You can download fspy in the description. You need to install the fspy add-on and then go under file, import fspy. You can see now everything is matched. I'm just going to move everything up. You can see the Y line and the X line match correctly. Now let's import in our dinosaur. So here is the dinosaur we're going to be using. You can get it in the description. Import it in your scene and you can see that it matches the scene correctly. I will do some basic lighting by adding a sky texture. And now let's add a shadow catcher. Let's add a plane. Turn this into a shadow catcher. Just go under the object, visibility, and turn on shadow catcher. You can see the object itself does not appear, but the shadows appear. Now you can also cast this shadow onto this building by just adding an additional object there. Add this, make sure that this aligns, and if your camera match was good, this should line up perfectly. You can also do this to the background block. Just going to round off this corner using Ctrl B, just like that. Now I can turn on shadow catcher for these as well, shadow catcher. And I want to change the direction of the sun. So I'm just going to go under my quick functions add-on, link a new sun so that I can just rotate that. That way I have easy control of the sun. My shadows are being casted onto the walls I've just created. So let's now add the background image. You can go to the compositor, use nodes, and also in the viewport overlays, turn on always so that we can see the compositor effects. Then in the render settings, go under film and turn on transparency so that the background is transparent. I can bring in the image we have, and if you preview this, you can see that's how it looks. You can zoom it out to match the camera. Blend this with this, use a mix node, mix color. This can be image 1 and this can be image 2. Now if I look at this, you get that. You can use the alpha input of this and you see what we get. Of course, the lighting doesn't match, but you can see how the shadows are being casted onto the walls. Now, if you want to add more detail, you can have this object interact with the ground by just subdividing this ground a bit, create a new material, and project this image onto that ground. So I can just unwrap projection from view. You can see how my UVs look. Now, if I go to texture, I can bring in that image texture, the same image texture from here. And you can see it should match our scene correctly. And use this as the base. You don't have to worry about how this looks in other areas as long as it looks correctly in your camera view. If you want to break up this ground, what you can do, you can select the parts that you want to break up. So for example, this area around my dinosaur, I can separate this into its own mesh. You can see now it's this part here. For this part, I don't want it to be a shadow catcher anymore. So I will remove the shadow catcher, but the materials changes a bit, play around with the different settings so that it looks correctly. You will have to do some additional color correction to get this to look correctly. Now I can extrude this, turn on the cell fracture add-on, go to object, quick effect, cell fracture. You want to set up a new collection, I'll call it Q, and you want to set up 2 materials for the thickness here. So I'll do another one like this. And then now I can go back to object, quick effect, cell fracture. I'll do 300 particles, increase the noise value, and make sure we're adding these to a collection, and also set an index for our material so that we have the second material as the material for this. Let's do 500 and then hit OK. Now that we have the fracturing done, make sure that our materials are done correctly as well. You can see, yeah, that's good. But I also want it to be for the sides here. So I'll just select everything, go to edit mode and make sure that I'm selecting all the faces here, just like that. And now we can assign this material to that as well. Just like that. You can turn off this, go back to here. You see we have a hole in this, but that's okay. We can go to geometry nodes, bring in the Q collection. If you look at that, you see this is just it. You want to use relative and separate so that the in-video pieces are separated. And we want to give these a rotation. So let's do a rotate instances, just like that. And we want to rotate them depending on how close they are to the dinosaur. So I'll go add in. So let me first pin this collection and then add in an empty, just like that. Drag that in here. I want to check its location, compare it to the position of each vertex using vector math and get the distance. This distance should drive our rotation. But before we do that, we need to align Euler to vector because we want all these points to face the empty. So I'll get the location again, subtract it from the position to get the vector I want and connect that to the rotation. This should have all these rotated towards our empty. So if I move this around, you can see it rotates, but you need to have the right axis. I think the Z is what we want. Now, I don't want all of these to be rotated. I want them to be rotated depending on the distance, their distance from the empty. So I'll use another vector math here, and this time I'll use the scale value. I'll use the distance for the scale. To have further control, I'll use a map range and just play with the numbers to see what gets me what I want. One other thing I forgot to mention is you need to set the position to be relative, just like that. So we can have this be anywhere on the fourth step, and we can control how much impact this has by just controlling this value here. Or you can use a ramp to have more precise control. Let's look at how this looks in the viewport. Again, you need to make sure that you turn off shadow capture so that we can still see the mesh itself. Now the original mesh is lost, so let's bring it back and join it back to this so you can see how everything looks. One other thing is scale these elements a bit by their distance from the empty as well. I can use a scale instances and basically just scale them by the distance. We need more control, so I'll add a float curve. Can just push it up a bit. One other thing I could do is come back to this, Shift D, duplicate it, and remove geometry nodes. Just go to edge mode and select the edges on the inside, Shift G, amount of faces around an edge, and you get that. I can deselect the outside and then just invert the selection, delete the vertices so that we have this, fill this in and then push it, extrude it down, just like that. I'm going to turn this into a dark void. I'll shade smooth and give this a new material that is dark so that we don't see those empty areas. Now, you can also push some of these up using a set position, combine X, Y, just like that. And we can still use the map range. Now, I can change this material into something like concrete. I'll go back to Q and select any of these particles and just change this material. Go back to the shader, go to my texture folders and look for a concrete texture. Yes, use something like this, import that in. I'm going to use this as the base. And I can go back to these objects, these instances, just make sure that I select only the interior and unwrap it using cube projection. And you can see now our concrete is mapped on correctly. Can close out of this and you can see what we have. This is going to be determined by the position of this here. If you want to even be extra, you can use a material select and use the material we created. So this would be, let's call this interior. Now, if we look at this, you can see it selects the interior elements of the scene. We can use a separate geometry that we want to separate by the material here. And that gives us these outside elements. With that, what we can do, let's look at the wireframe, subdivide these, give this a few cuts, and we can introduce some noise. And normal. The normal can go into the offset. For this to work, we need to realize these instances. We need a vector math, set the operation to scale, and let's scale by the noise. We can use a math node to subtract the offset added by the noise. We can scale the effect, reduce the strength of the effect, just like that. But if we join this back to the original, we are going to see that some of the parts, if we join this with this, some of the parts don't match correctly, especially at some areas here. We need to create another mask that stops the noise being added to the top edges, because that changes how these faces are connected to the original mesh. So to do that, I'm going to use edge neighbors, and just compare if any of these have less than, I think, 2, and you'll see that it will select the top faces and the bottom faces, which means that the bottom faces are also not getting selected in our selection. So I'll go in my queue collection, make sure that I have everything there selected, and select everything at the bottom and make sure that it's assigned to the interior material as well. Go back to our mesh and look at this. We only have the top parts selected, and that is what we're going to use for our set position, so that the noise is only affected to the bottom part but not the top part. Just like that. Now I think I need to invert this, so I'll use a boolean math and the operation set to not. That way they still match with the top faces we cut. So if we join this, to the top parts, these parts, and I think it should be by face, yeah, they should weld perfectly. So I'll just use the join here. So you see they match perfectly. Without this selection, there are some gaps like here. And actually, if I turn on face orientation, you can see the gaps more easily. But if I add in this selection, we close them, except for some intersecting that maybe the noise is a bit too much. But I'm okay with some slight intersections. So now you can just join this here, and we have a much more detailed, we still need the shade smooth here. Okay, we have a much more detailed mesh. So if we go to our render, yeah, you can see that there is more detail. You can even add extra detail to this by adding some extra particles onto this, but that would be too much for this tutorial. Then all you have to do is try to make sure your lighting matches. And you will be good to go. You can see we have some harsh shadows in the back there, and that's because that we set our mesh is being affected by lighting. This is still procedural. I can move this damage around. You can do some color correction, so you can go back to the compositor. So for this area, I'm just going to come in here and select this P, separate it, and I think I need to remove geometry nodes for this. And for the rest of the mesh, I can turn it into a shadow catcher. Now that means we just have to match the color of this here. To match the colors better, you can see we have some harsh lines here. And the other thing is, you will notice is that this image here is not locked to the camera view. So when I move my camera, it doesn't scale with the camera, but in the render, it will be fine. So one thing I want to do is to make sure that these lines blend much better instead of being harsh like that. So what I'm going to do is select this and make sure that I'm in the right material. So this is the projected material. I can use a gradient texture, and that is going to look like this. Instead of using linear, I'm going to use gradient. I'm going to use spherical, and make sure, also let me make sure that the origin is at the center of the geometry, just like that. And make sure that I'm using object mapping, yeah, something like that. And I use a ramp. We are running into an issue that this ramp is affecting these individually, because in our geometry nodes, these are still instances. So I need to realize those as well. So I should just realize this here. so that instead is treated as one single entity. I'll go back to the shader editor and can look at my gradient, scale it up, and I want mostly the boundaries of this edge to be untouched. So I'll scale it on the Y, so that everything that has these pieces is within that mask. Yeah, something like that. I can use this as the alpha, and if you're using Eevee, you might want to change alpha blending to the blending mode. Go alpha blend to see the results. You can see now this is blending better. Let's go back to cycles and make sure the other object does not have this blending issue. So I'm just going to make sure this has a separate material like that. Yeah, you can see that now the blending is much better. In here, you can see we no longer have that hash line. So if I remove this, you can see the hash line, and now it's not there. This is blended better. You can see the shadow is casted really nicely onto the buildings if we want that. Yeah, something like that. And I think the sun has to be a bit softer, so I'll use something like 30 to blend things. Let's try 5. You can play with the colors. We can add to the scene. Let's add in some contrast, more contrast like that. Make it a bit warmer, just like that. Again, this is all still dynamic. I can move this around